Mason arrived in the town just after the first frost, when the trees stood bare and the sky hung low like it was holding something back, and no one noticed at first because strangers came and went from time to time, passing through on their way to nowhere. But Mason was different. He did not look around. He did not ask for food or shelter. He walked with a slow, heavy rhythm. Like every step cost him something, and the only thing he ever seemed to look at was the horizon. He wore a coat, too, thin for the cold and boots worn for walking, and his hands stayed buried in his pockets, even when the wind bit at his fingers, and his breath came out in little clouds that vanished fast, like they were afraid of staying near him long. And though he never smiled or spoke a single word to anyone, people remembered his face because there was something in it, something that made them uneasy, something that said he had seen things that should not be seen. The old woman at the gas station said she saw him staring at the burned-down church for almost an hour once, standing perfectly still, like he was waiting for it to rise again. And the boy at the grocery store said Mason came in every other night and bought only bread and water, once a knife with a black handle that he tucked into his coat like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for him. The sheriff asked him his name once, just out of routine, just to know who he had in his town, but Mason just looked at him with eyes that did not flinch, and after a long moment the sheriff simply nodded and walked away. Later he told his deputy that some men carried something heavier than a record, something worse than guilt, and you can see it if you look close enough. No one knew where he slept or where he came from. Some thought he stayed in the old logging cabin, out past the tracks. Others said he never slept at all, and wandered the roads all night, whispering to something that only he could see. But the children liked him, especially Eli, who had never learned fear, not yet, and who believed every person was just a friend. He had not met Eli, followed him once from the gas station, all the way to the edge of the woods, where Mason turned slowly and looked at him, not angry, not smiling, just looking, and then without a word, Mason turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Eli standing there with a puzzled look and a strange feeling in his chest that he did not understand. That night, Eli told his mother that the quiet man in the coat was a monster hunter, that he could smell danger, and that was why he never talked, because if he did, the monsters might hear him. And his mother smiled and ruffled his hair, not knowing that soon she would come to understand silence in a way she never had before, and the name Mason would become something she would never forget for as long as she lived. Mason arrived in the town just after the first frost, when the trees stood bare and the sky hung low like it was holding something back, and no one noticed at first because strangers came and went from time to time, passing through on their way to nowhere. But Mason was different. He did not look around. He did not ask for food or shelter. He walked with a slow, heavy rhythm. Like every step cost him something, and the only thing he ever seemed to look at was the horizon. He wore a coat, too thin for the cold and boots worn for walking, and his hands stayed buried in his pockets, even when the wind bit at his fingers and his breath came out in little clouds that vanished fast, like they were afraid of staying near him long. And though he never smiled or spoke a single word to anyone, people remembered his face because there was something in it, something that made them uneasy, something that said he had seen things that should not be seen. The old woman at the gas station said she saw him staring at the burned-down church for almost an hour, once standing perfectly still like he was waiting for it to rise again. And the boy at the grocery store said Mason came in every other night and bought only bread and water, and once a knife with a black handle that he tucked into his coat like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for him. The sheriff asked him his name once, just out of routine, just to know who he had in his town, but Mason just looked at him with eyes that did not flinch, and after a long moment the sheriff simply nodded and walked away. Later he told his deputy that some men carried something heavier than a record, something worse than guilt, and you can see it if you look close enough. No one knew where he slept or where he came from. Some thought he stayed in the old logging cabin, out past the tracks. Others said he never slept at all, and wandered the roads all night, whispering to something that only he could see. But the children liked him, especially Eli, who had never learned fear, not yet. Ali woke early that morning, before the sun, before the roosters, before the sound of the town began to stretch itself into the day. He had a habit of waking up with ideas, strange little plans, that only made sense to a boy who still believed the world was wide and full of secrets. And that morning his idea was simple: find the quiet man, and ask him what monsters he had fought. Slipped out the back door with a slice of bread, and his red jacket, the one with the missing zipper and the sleeves too short. His mother was still asleep, and the kettle on the stove had not even begun to rattle. He tiptoed past the creaky board by the window and ran barefoot across the frost-tipped grass, his breath rising in clouds as he giggled at his own cleverness. Knew where the man usually went. There was a path behind the diner where the trees leaned close together, and the old power lines buzzed overhead like they were whispering secrets, and Elo followed that path, calling out softly at first, then louder, when no one answered. "Mr. Hunter," he said. "Mr. Monster Hunter, where are you? I brought you some bread. It is not much, but you look like someone who forgets to eat sometimes, and I thought maybe you would tell me a story, or let me help you find a monster, or maybe just walk with you for a little while." Walked deeper into the trees, leaves crunching beneath his feet, his fingers going numb, but his smile still wide because the air smelled like moss and earth and adventure the way only a child can smell it, and far ahead, just barely, he saw a figure standing still just like before, facing the woods as if listening to something that had no voice. Silly hurried toward him, waving the bread in his hand and calling out again, this time louder, "Hey, mister, wait up. I found you again. Are you hunting something scary? Do you need help?" "I am not scared of anything, not even the shadows under my bed, not even the old well behind the church." But the figure did not move, not even a little, and for a moment Eli slowed his steps. Something inside him fluttered. Not fear, not yet, but something cold and uncertain. He was close now, close enough to see the way the man stood like stone, with his hands still buried in his coat and his head tilted slightly like he was listening to the trees breathe. Listen, turned slowly and looked down at the boy, and this time there was something different in his eyes, not surprise, not anger, something like recognition or confusion or maybe even dread. And Eli opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat because suddenly he felt very small and very alone, and very unsure of what he had followed into the woods. Wind shifted, the light through the branches flickered like the sky was blinking, and somewhere far behind them the church bell rang, once sharp and hollow, and the bread fell from Eli's hand to the ground, where it landed without a sound and was quickly forgotten. Who believed every person was just a friend. He had not met Eli, followed him once from the gas station all the way to the edge of the woods, where Mason turned slowly and looked at him, not angry, not smiling, just looking, and then, without a word, Mason turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Eli standing there with a puzzled look and a strange feeling in his chest that he did not understand. That night Eli told his mother that the quiet man in the coat was a monster hunter, that he could smell danger, and that was why he never talked, because if he did the monsters might hear him. And his mother smiled and ruffled his hair, not knowing that soon she would come to understand silence in a way she never had before, and the name Mason would become something she would never forget for as long as she lived. The search began when the sun was still climbing behind the hills, casting long shadows over the rooftops and fields, the kind of shadows that make you feel like something is watching from just beyond the light. And when Eli's mother woke to an empty bed and cold sheets, she knew before she looked, she knew before she asked, that something was wrong. Neighbors gathered first, then the sheriff and his deputies, and within the hour the whole town was out calling his name, walking the roads, checking the ditches, climbing the fences, and opening every shed and cellar and barn door, as if he might be hiding like he used to during games of hide and seekily. "Eli, where are you, buddy? Come on now. This isn't funny anymore. You're scaring your mom, and she's worried sick." But Eli did not answer, and the wind offered no clues, and the woods beyond the diner seemed quieter than usual, like the trees were holding their breath. By noon the dogs were out sniffing along the river bank and behind the church and into the narrow trails where the ground was still damp from the last rain, and the prints were hard to follow and scattered the way a child runs when he is chasing butterflies or running from something he does not understand. It was Mrs. Hayden who screamed first, her hands flying to her mouth, her knees buckling in the grass by the edge of the river where the reeds grew tall and the mud was soft, and there, in the cold water, was something small and red and soaked through, a jacket with one sleeve twisted and a patch of cartoon eyes staring up from the shallows. He pulled him from the river with shaking hands and broken prayers, his skin pale and lips blue, and the sheriff removed his hat and whispered something no one could hear before walking slowly back toward town with the jacket pressed to his chest like it weighed 1,000 pounds. No one said the word, not at first, because saying it would make it real, and reality was something none of them wanted to face. Not yet, not with Eli's mother still standing by the kitchen door with her hands wrapped around the frame and her eyes searching the horizon like she could pull him back with just the strength of her will. He found Mason sitting on a fallen log deep in the woods near the place where the branches hang low and the moss grows thick. He was quiet, his coat damp, his hands stained dark, and when the deputy asked him what happened, he just looked at the ground and said, "I thought he was something else. The deputy asked something like what, and Mason just shook his head and said it was wrong. I was wrong and I didn't mean to. It was supposed to be something else. They put him in the back of the cruiser and he didn't resist and he didn't speak again, and when they passed the burned-down church he looked at it with something close to fear and something worse than guilt, and the trees seemed to lean away from the road as he went by." They locked Mason in the single cell behind the sheriff's office, the one that had not been used in years, the one with the peeling paint and rusted bars and a single light bulb that buzzed like it had something to say but never could find the words. The townspeople gathered outside in silence, no torches, no shouting, just eyes full of grief and confusion, and the kind of fear that twists into anger when left too long in the dark. Sheriff sat at his desk with his hands folded and his jaw clenched tight. He had been through war and storms and fires, but nothing like this, nothing that came without warning or reason, nothing that shattered the soul of a town with one broken child and one quiet man. Deputy Carver brought in the evidence: a torn jacket, a muddy shoe, the red thread still clinging to the sole like it had refused to let go, like it had tried to hold on to something that could not be saved. He placed it all on the table and looked at the sheriff with eyes that asked, "What now?" But the sheriff had no answer. Wormson sat on the cot with his head down, his fingers twitching as if counting something or trying to remember how to feel. He did not ask for food or water. He did not ask for forgiveness. He only whispered once, to himself, over and over, "I thought it was something else. I thought it was not real. I thought the eyes were wrong." When they asked him what he meant, he said the child was not the child. He said the air changed when the boy came near. He said his shadow moved the wrong way. He said he heard voices in the trees and saw shapes behind his eyes, and the sheriff wanted to hit him, wanted to shake him, wanted to make him bleed answers, but instead he just stood and walked away because some words cut deeper. Then Knivestown held its breath waiting for Eli's mother to return, and no one dared speak her name, not since the last time she came home in uniform. With medals no one understood and stories no one dared confirm. She was not like the rest of them. She had seen things, fought things, survived things, and there were rumors she had done worse. Masson had no idea who she was, no idea what kind of fire he had kindled with the act of taking her son from this world, and no idea how close she was to arriving. She had been stationed 3 states away, commanding a division too secret to be named, and when the message reached her, her heart did not break, it hardened, and her orders changed from defense to return, and every soldier under her knew that whatever had happened to her child was now part of a storm they would not stop and could not control. The train brought her home just after midnight, and the wind howled like it knew what she had become, and the town went silent as she stepped onto the platform, her boots hitting the boards like a drumbeat before a march to war. She walked from the train station without speaking to anyone, without even glancing at the faces that lined the platform and the narrow street. Beyond, she wore a plain dark coat buttoned to the throat, but the way she moved betrayed the soldier. Beneath every step, measured every turn, deliberate, her gaze fixed forward as if she could already see the man who had taken her son. The sheriff stood waiting outside his office, his hat in his hands and his mouth ready to form the words he did not want to say, but when she reached him, he did not speak. He just looked at her, and then stepped aside, because there are moments when authority is no longer yours, and he understood. This was one of them. She opened the door to the jail with a slow, steady push, and the hinges groaned like they were warning the man inside. She stepped into the dim hallway where the single light swung gently overhead, and the smell of damp stone and rust clung to the air. The cell was at the far end, and she could see him before he saw her, sitting hunched on the cot, his shoulders drawn, in his head bowed. Masson lifted his eyes when her boots stopped in front of the bars, and for the first time since his arrest there was something like movement in his expression. It was not fear, not yet. It was the beginning of it, the recognition of something in her posture and in her eyes that told him she was not here to listen, she was not here to question, she was here for something. Finality. Guards pretended not to listen, but every ear strained to hear the sound of her voice. She said his name once, low and even, and he flinched as if struck. Then she asked him a question with no mercy in it. "Why did you take my son from me?" And when he did not answer, she repeated it, word for word, and this time her tone carried the weight of steel. Mason opened his mouth, but the words came like a confession to something greater than a crime. He said, "It was not him, it was something else." He said the boy was not what he seemed. He said he saw a shadow move across his eyes, and a whisper told him to stop it before it was too late. He said he was wrong, but he could not take it back. Her face did not change, not even a flicker. She stood there for a long time looking at him, as if she were seeing the shape of his soul and finding it smaller than she expected. Then she turned without another word and walked away, her steps just as measured as when she came in, but the air behind her seemed heavier, as if she had taken something with her. The sheriff watched her leave and did not try to stop her. He knew she would not rest, and he knew Mason would not see another dawn. The only question left was whether it would happen in the cell or somewhere far darker. When the sun crept fully over the hills, casting gold over rooftops and fences and the wet dirt paths, the general stepped back into the jail, and the door creaked open like it feared her presence. Mason was still there, still sitting on the cot, unmoving, as if he had become part of the shadows around him, and when he looked up at her, something inside him flinched. At this time, she did not speak. Not right away. She simply pulled a chair from the wall and placed it across from him, not close, not far, just enough to see his face in full light. And Mason did not look away because there was something in her gaze that demanded truth, and he knew by now that lies would not survive. Haresh leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped between her knees, and her voice when it came was quiet, not cold, not cruel, just deliberate. She asked him what he saw, not what he thought, not what he believed, what he actually saw. Mason hesitated, his lips parting then closing again, as if the words had edges sharp enough to hurt. And when he finally spoke, he did not look at her, he looked at the floor, and he said the boy had followed him through the trees, and at first it had felt normal, just a kid, curious, just a shadow, but then the air changed, said the birds had gone silent and the wind stopped, and he turned to tell the boy to go back home, but the boy's eyes were glowing, not bright, not like a flashlight, but like embers, slow and pulsing and wrong, and his voice had changed. It spoke in something that sounded like Eli but was not Eli, and it told him to kneel. General listened without a blink, her face unreadable, her breath steady like she had heard worse or had expected something just as strange, and she asked him if he was certain, if he truly believed what he saw, and Mason looked at her for the first time and said, "I do not believe anything anymore. I only know what happened." Eddie said he had drawn the knife not to hurt, but to defend. And when he stepped forward, the thing flinched and hissed, like steam on iron, and then it looked like Eli again, and it cried and begged and fell, and when it stopped moving, the world felt normal again, and the birds came back, and he did not understand what he had done, or who he had done it. Tough General sat in silence after that, her hands still, her posture straight as if sitting in a war room, and behind her the deputy stood frozen, afraid to speak because he too had heard the voice in Mason's story, and he could feel the weight of something not explained. Stood and walked out without a word, and the door closed behind her like the end of a sentence that did not need repeating. She walked down the steps and looked out at the town where children played again, unaware of how close the dark had come, and how thin the wall was between what they knew and what they never would. The town returned to a strange quiet after her visit, like the sound had been drained from it, like everyone was waiting for something to end, but no one knew what. The children still played, and the farmers still worked, and the church bell still rang on Sunday morning, but nothing felt the same. Not really, not with Mason locked in that cell, and the general moving through the streets like a ghost made of irons. Did not cry, not once, not at the riverbank, not at the grave, not in the old house that still smelled like her son, and held pieces of him in every corner. The drawings on the fridge, the blanket on the couch, the empty shoes by the door, all of it waiting for someone who would never walk through that door again. But she did not cry, because she had learned long ago that tears were weapons wasted on the past, and she had never been one to waste anything, not energy, not pain, not time, and so instead she prepared, as she always had. She mapped every movement and counted every variable, and watched every shadow that stretched too long across the ground. The sheriff met her again, by the old train tracks where no trains came anymore. He lit a cigarette, but did not smoke it, just held it between his fingers and said, "I know that look, and I know what it means, and I cannot stop you, but I need to ask if this is justice or if this is something else." Chef looked at him and said, "I buried my child, and I sat across from the man who took him, and I listened to him tell me a story that makes no sense unless you have lived through things no one speaks of, and I have, and I know what fear looks like, and I know what lies feel like, and that man is not lying." Sheriff did not answer because he had heard the same story, and though he did not want to believe it, part of him did, and it scared him, not because it was impossible, but because it was familiar. And he told her the cell would be unlocked at midnight, and no one would be on watch, and no one would remember what happened afterward, and she nodded and walked away. Mason sat in the cell staring at the wall, whispering again and again, To himself, not praying, not apologizing. Just repeating the same sentence like it was all he had left. I thought it was something else. Thought it was something else. I thought it was something else. Sand outside, the stars turned slowly over the town, and the wind curled through the alleyways and into the trees, and something deep beneath the surface of the earth shifted slightly, like a breath being held for too long and waiting to be released. And in her hands the general held a key and a blade, and neither of them shook. The clock struck midnight, and the streetlights flickered once as if uncertain whether to stay lit, and then dimmed to a soft hum that barely touched the shadows. The town was asleep, or pretending to be, and the wind moved gently through the empty alleys, carrying with it the sound of footsteps, slow and steady and certain. She moved through the dark like she belonged to it, not hurried, not hiding, just walking, as if every step was already decided, as if the world had no power to stop her anymore. The key was cold in her hand, and the blade felt like an extension of her own will, and when she reached the back door of the jail, it opened without resistance, and no one waited. No one watched, and even the air inside seemed still, like the building was holding its breath. She walked down the narrow hallway, past the empty desks, and the sleeping dog, and the files that meant nothing now. And when she reached the cell, she stopped and looked at him. Emerson was awake, sitting exactly where she had last seen him, eyes open, and hollow hands resting on his knees. He looked up when she entered, but did not speak, and she did not either, not at first, because this was not a moment for words. This was the final moment in a story that should never have happened. And yet here it was, breathing in front of them. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. And he did not move, did not flinch, did not plead. His eyes followed her, and he said, "I know what this is, and I am not afraid." And she said, "You should be." And then she sat across from him once again, just like before, only now the air between them was heavier and filled with something unspoken. Said, "I see his face every time I close my eyes, and I do not know if it was him, or if it was something wearing his shape. I do not know if I saved anyone, or if I destroyed the only good thing left in the world." And she said, "That uncertainty is your sentence, and it will never end." Placed the blade on the bench between them, and said, "You are not going to prison, and you are not walking free, and the choice is not mine, it is yours, and you know what you saw, and you know what you did, and you will carry it longer than any bars could hold." Yo looked at the blade, and then at her, and there was a moment where something changed in his face, something like peace but not quite, and he reached for it. Slowly, like it was heavy, like it resisted him, like it wanted to stay. Cold metal in the dark and not become part of an ending. She turned and walked out the door. And this time she did not look back, and the cell closed behind her without a sound, and no one ever opened it again. Next morning the sheriff found it empty, no blood, no body, just the blade on the floor, and the words scratched into the wall. "I saw the shadow, and it wore his eyes." The town never spoke of it again, not in the open, not in whispers, not even in the quiet moments when people gather and run out of things to say. It became something unspoken, something sealed behind glances and silent prayers, and the kind of fear that never fully leaves, no matter how much time passes. Sally was buried on the hill above the river, the place where the sun always touched first in the morning, where the wind moved soft through the grass and the flowers never seemed to die. His mother stood there alone as the earth was placed back over him, her face like stone, her eyes like glass, and no one stood near her, not even the priest, not even the sheriff, because some grief makes a person untouchable. Blade was locked in a drawer in the back of the sheriff's office, and no one ever opened it again, not even on cold nights, when strange things howled in the trees and the dogs would not stop barking, and people swore they saw shadows pass by the edge of the woods with eyes that blinked the wrong way. Mason was never found, not his body, not his clothes, not his footprints, only the words on the wall, and even those were eventually painted over by someone who could no longer bear to read them, but the memory of them lived in the space they left behind, like a scar where no wound remains. General left 2 days later without a suitcase, without goodbyes. She walked out of the house and down the road and past the field where Eli used to chase butterflies, and never looked back. The neighbors watched from windows, but no one dared speak, no one dared ask where she would go or what she would do, because they already knew she did not return to command. She did not return to war. She disappeared into the world like smoke after fire, and the only signs of her came in stories half believed of a woman who arrived in strange towns and sat silently near places where strange deaths had happened, and then disappeared before dawn. The town moved on, as towns do, slowly, and with some shame. They fixed the fences, they cleaned the church, they reopened the diner, and children played again in the schoolyard, but no one let them near the woods, not anymore, not even in daylight, not even in groups, and sometimes at night, when the wind was sharp and the moon hung low, people heard a voice, faint and broken, saying the same thing over and over. I thought it was something else, and the next morning they said it was just the wind and went about their day, but those who had seen her, those who had heard her speak and watched her bury her son, they knew better. They knew that sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they wear familiar faces, and sometimes justice does not come with sirens or sentences, but with silence. And Steeland, they knew one more thing, that she had not taken revenge, she had delivered a sentence, and in doing so had left something colder behind, something that would never truly leave the town again.